Amelia Wright was found dead in her home, 8 weeks pregnant, and the circumstances surrounding her death were anything but clear. Her husband, James Wright, would be the first to discover her lifeless body. He would be the one to call 911, his voice trembling as he informed the dispatcher that his wife had taken her own life. But as the story unfolded, the truth would become harder to ignore. Was Amelia's death really a suicide, as her husband claimed? Or was there more to this tragedy than anyone could have imagined? James Wright, a man once seen as a loving husband, seemed devastated by the loss. But as investigators dug deeper into the events leading up to Amelia's death, questions began to emerge. How could a seemingly perfect couple, pregnancy, future plans, a seemingly happy life, be torn apart so violently? Could James, a man who had vowed to protect his wife, have played a role in her untimely demise? When detectives started peeling back the layers of this tragic story, the inconsistencies in James's statement started to pile up. His account of the night's events, his behavior afterward, none of it added up. The more they learned, the more suspicious things became. James had painted a picture of a loving husband and a perfect family. But what if that image had been shattered long before Amelia's death? What if everything James had told the authorities about that fateful night was a lie? In a case that would send shockwaves through their quiet suburban neighborhood, the truth would slowly begin to reveal itself. The clues were there, but it would take a sharp mind and an unrelenting pursuit of the truth to expose what had really happened behind the closed doors of the Wrights' home. The world was about to learn that some stories have far darker endings than anyone could have predicted. And for one grieving husband, his story was about to unravel, piece by piece. Amelia Wright was a woman who had everything to live for. At just 28 years old, she was a skilled and compassionate physical therapist, known for her dedication to her patients. Amelia had been married to James Wright for nearly 5 years. They lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Houston, Texas, a place where life seemed simple and peaceful. To their friends and neighbors, they were the picture of a happy couple. Successful careers, a home filled with love, and the excitement of expecting their first child. James, a man in his early 30s, worked as a contractor. He was tall, well-spoken, and appeared every bit the supportive husband. To the outside world, James and Amelia's life seemed perfect, maybe even enviable. They had dreams of expanding their family, buying a bigger home to raise their growing family, and perhaps even starting a business together. Amelia was thrilled about the baby. She was already making plans for her maternity leave and spending quality time with James before the big changes came. However, despite this outward perfection, there were cracks forming beneath the surface, invisible to those closest to them. Amelia didn't know it yet, but her husband was carrying a burden he'd been hiding for months, a burden he would later go to great lengths to conceal. James had become increasingly distant, not just emotionally, but physically. Late nights at work turned into weekends spent away from home. He was no longer as attentive to Amelia's needs, and their once thriving relationship began to wither. At first, Amelia chalked it up to the stress of their growing responsibilities. But deep down, she could sense something was wrong, a subtle shift in his behavior. Something was different about James. He was no longer the man she had married, the man who had been there for her, holding her hand through the ups and downs. Instead, she was faced with a stranger. Unbeknownst to Amelia, James was hiding a dangerous secret. His debts were mounting, and he had begun an affair with a younger woman named Sophie, a colleague from one of his side projects. The affair wasn't just about passion, it was a means to an end. Sophie promised James a way out of his financial troubles, a way to escape the looming threat of bankruptcy. In his mind, Sophie represented a fresh start, a chance to solve all his problems, and in his desperation, he began to lose sight of what mattered most, his wife, Amelia. Despite the growing tension between them, Amelia remained hopeful. She still believed in the love they had shared, and she trusted that things would get better once the baby was born. She never imagined that the very person she loved and trusted the most would become her executioner. As James's behavior grew more erratic, the walls around their seemingly perfect life began to crumble. But Amelia was blind to it. As we begin, please watch to the end because we'd need your opinion on this story. Also, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on more crime cases like this one. The calm before the storm seemed so ordinary, so typical of a couple in the final stages of pregnancy. But what Amelia couldn't see was that the foundation of their lives was built on lies. The perfect image of their family would soon shatter, and a nightmare would take its place. The next few days would change everything for the Wrights. And as the truth started to come to light, no one could have predicted the horrors that lay ahead. James Wright had always been the kind of man who put on a good front. He presented himself as a devoted husband, always striving to make his wife happy, to build the life they had dreamed of together. On the outside, it seemed as if nothing could go wrong. But behind that carefully crafted image, James was drowning in debt. What began as small financial missteps had ballooned into something far more serious. Unpaid bills, loans he could never seem to pay off, credit cards maxed out. Each new problem piled on top of the last. James had been living with the constant pressure of a life he couldn't afford, and with each passing day, it felt like he was losing his grip. Amelia had no idea. She had been so focused on their future, on their baby, that she couldn't see the storm forming around her husband. James did his best to hide his struggles, to keep the facade of a perfect life intact. Amelia had always trusted him, trusted that, together, they would work through anything. She didn't know the extent of his troubles, nor did she suspect the secrets he was keeping from her. Amelia was too focused on her career, her pregnancy, and the hope that they would soon be able to bring their child into a world full of love and possibility. Amelia Wright was everything her husband had ever wanted in a partner. She was dedicated, both to her career as a physical therapist and to her family. She poured herself into her work, helping others recover from injury and illness, with a kindness that earned her the respect of her colleagues. But even more so, Amelia devoted herself to her marriage. She had dreams of starting a family with James, of creating a warm home where they could raise their child together. She believed in the future, in the love that she and James had built. To her friends and family, Amelia was the epitome of loyalty, a woman who would stand by her partner, no matter the obstacles they faced. But what Amelia didn't know was that her husband had been slipping away from her long before she discovered the truth. James had been hiding a dangerous secret, an affair. Sophie, a younger woman from one of James's side projects, had entered his life at a time when he felt the walls closing in on him. She wasn't just a fling. Sophie represented an escape, a way out of his mounting debts, a way to avoid the inevitable collapse of the life he had built with Amelia. Sophie promised James she could help him secure high-paying jobs, a means to dig himself out of the financial hole he had created. She was his solution, a temporary escape from the life he no longer wanted. As the affair deepened, so did James's desperation. He knew that his marriage with Amelia was on the brink, but the more entangled he became with Sophie, the harder it was to let go. He started to withdraw from Amelia, his emotional distance growing with each passing day. His late nights at work became more frequent, his phone buzzing with texts from Sophie that he couldn't bear for Amelia to see. What had started as a small lie, pretending to be busy with work, had evolved into a web of deceit so thick that James could no longer see a way out. He was trapped, caught between his obligations to his wife and his overwhelming desire for a fresh start with Sophie. Amelia, though, remained loyal. She kept pushing forward, focused on their future, the baby they would soon welcome into their lives. She had no idea that her husband's heart and mind had already wandered elsewhere. She trusted James completely, her faith in him unwavering. She believed in the life they had built together. But in the shadows, James's lies continued to grow, and the truth was inching ever closer to being exposed. As the days went by, James's secret life began to feel more like a pressure cooker about to explode. The financial strain, the affair, the mounting tension between him and Amelia, it all reached a tipping point. The life he had worked so hard to build with Amelia, the one that had seemed so perfect on the outside, was crumbling from within. And yet, in his mind, there was only one way to escape it all, one way to rid himself of the consequences of his actions. James Wright had put everything on the line, and soon he would make a choice that would forever alter the course of his life, and the life of his wife, Amelia. The stage was set for a tragedy that no one could have seen coming. As the days went by, the tension between James and Amelia only grew. What had once been a loving, carefree relationship began to feel more like a cold war. James's behavior became increasingly suspicious. He would come home late, claiming to be working long hours on construction projects, but his excuses began to wear thin. Amelia couldn't ignore the signs, the little things that once seemed like quirks, his detachment, his unwillingness to share details about his day, were now impossible to overlook. Despite her growing concerns, Amelia wanted to believe the best in James. She knew he had always been a hard worker, and she tried to rationalize his behavior. After all, they were expecting a child, and the pressures of impending fatherhood could change anyone. But deep down, Amelia could sense that something wasn't right. The late nights, the constant excuses, each small crack in their relationship slowly widened, and her doubts began to fester. One afternoon, Amelia had come home earlier than usual. She had planned to surprise James with a homemade dinner, a gesture to show him that, despite the distance between them, she still cared. As she entered their bedroom, she noticed something that would change everything. A phone lying on the bed. It wasn't her phone, and it wasn't James's either. It was an old, outdated model, one that didn't seem to belong in their home. Her heart raced as she picked it up. She didn't know what compelled her to check it. Perhaps it was the nagging feeling she'd had for weeks. But when she unlocked the phone, what she saw shattered her world. There, in plain view, were text messages between James and a woman named Sophie. The messages were casual at first, but as she scrolled, the tone became more intimate. Words of affection, promises of future plans, and secret meetings. It became clear that James had been carrying on an affair for months, while his wife remained in the dark. Amelia's heart shattered in an instant. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved for years, had betrayed her. The realization was crushing, but what hurt even more was the thought of how deeply he had hidden it from her. She never suspected, never imagined that the life they had built together could be torn apart by something so hidden, so devastating. Still, even with the evidence in front of her, Amelia couldn't bring herself to confront him immediately. She had always believed in their love. In the future, they had promised each other. So she tried to push it to the back of her mind. Perhaps it was a mistake, a temporary lapse. But deep down, the knowledge that James had been lying to her every day gnawed at her. The emotional distance between them, once subtle, now felt unbearable. The intimacy they once shared had dwindled to almost nothing. James avoided her touch, avoided her gaze, and the emptiness between them seemed to widen with each passing day. It wasn't long before Amelia couldn't ignore the cracks in their marriage any longer. That evening, she confronted James. The conversation began calmly, almost like a casual discussion, but the air was thick with tension. Amelia held up the phone, the evidence staring back at her. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were sharp with hurt. "Who is Sophie?" she asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" James, caught completely off guard, tried to deny everything at first. He claimed the messages were harmless, just a silly fling. But Amelia wasn't buying it. The lies were so transparent, so hollow, and with each word that came from his mouth, the betrayal felt more suffocating. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" Amelia's voice cracked as the hurt poured out. "Why did you keep this from me?" The confrontation escalated, the emotions too much for either of them to contain. James grew defensive, angry. He couldn't believe she had invaded his privacy, but deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. His face flushed with rage, not from the guilt of his actions, but from the fear of being exposed. Amelia, devastated by the man she thought she knew, broke down in front of him, her heart shattered by the years of lies that had been building behind her back. What followed was an emotional explosion. James, caught between the woman he had promised to love forever and the woman he thought could provide him with a way out, became frantic. Words were thrown in anger, accusations hurled back and forth, but in the end, it was all noise, distractions from the cold, hard truth that neither of them could escape. That night, after their argument, things were never the same. Amelia went to bed crying, exhausted from the emotional turmoil. She couldn't bring herself to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of betrayal, heartbreak, and the future. James, meanwhile, retreated into the other room, his mind clouded with the weight of his own actions. He knew what he had to do. He had no choice anymore. The life he had built with Amelia was falling apart, and it seemed there was only one way left to salvage anything. The tension between them reached a breaking point, one that neither of them could have predicted. The emotional divide that had been building for months finally erupted. Amelia's love, her trust, had been shattered. But James's desperation was far stronger. What would come next was irreversible, and the consequences would be far more devastating than either of them could have imagined. The night of the argument between James and Amelia marked a shift that neither of them could have reversed. Amelia, still reeling from the betrayal, confronted James one last time. She was no longer willing to stay quiet, to pretend that everything was fine. The phone, the lies, the distance, everything had come to light. Her voice cracked as she demanded the truth, demanding answers from the man she had trusted so completely. James, though, was not the man she had married. The guilt, the mounting pressure, and the fear of exposure had driven him to the edge. His debts were catching up to him. His affair with Sophie was on the verge of being uncovered. And now Amelia was asking questions he had no answers for. He was cornered, and when people feel trapped, they lash out. In that heated moment, when Amelia's words pierced through the walls of his guilt, James snapped. A surge of anger flooded him, overwhelming everything else. In a fit of rage, he shoved her. Amelia lost her balance, her back hitting the floor with a sickening thud. She gasped for air, a stunned look in her eyes, not understanding how it had come to this, how the man she loved could have done this to her. But for James, this was only the beginning. Amelia, struggling to regain her breath, looked up at him with disbelief in her eyes. "You're going to kill me, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice shaking with both fear and hurt. Those words, those final words of realization, cut through James like a knife. The weight of what he had done began to sink in. but there was no going back now. His mind raced, his pulse quickened. His emotions swung from anger to fear, from panic to desperation. The plan had to be perfect. There could be no mistakes. As Amelia gasped, attempting to push herself off the floor, her eyes never left James. She saw the shift in his expression, the sudden coldness that replaced the anger, and the terrifying realization that he had already made up his mind. She knew he wasn't just angry anymore. He was determined to end it. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. James looked at Amelia, her body still racked with the aftermath of his violent push, and he made his decision. He reached down and grabbed the pillowcase from their bed. The soft fabric felt like a death sentence in his hands, but it didn't matter. His mind was made up. With a speed that startled even him, he wrapped the pillowcase around her neck. Amelia, struggling, gasping for air, fought back, but James was stronger. She kicked and flailed, but it was too late. The life drained from her as James tightened his grip. Her struggles grew weaker, until finally she stopped moving altogether. The silence that followed was deafening. James stood there staring down at the woman he had killed. Her body lay still, lifeless, a tragic end to the life they had once shared. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He had to cover his tracks. His hands trembled as he carefully arranged her body. He moved her, placed the pillowcase just so, and positioned her in a way that would make her death seem like a suicide. He had to make sure it looked like she had hung herself, that it looked like the tragedy of a woman driven to despair. The perfect crime, or so he thought. James stepped back and surveyed the scene, his breath shallow, his heart racing. He couldn't afford to slip up now. He had to play his part. James called 911. His voice was strained, full of false panic. "My wife, she's dead. I think she took her own life." His words were barely coherent, his mind clouded with the weight of what he had just done. The dispatcher asked for details, but all James could manage were the words that were sure to seal his fate. "She's dead. She hung herself." He hung up the phone and waited. The sound of his own breathing seemed so loud in the stillness of the room. His mind raced, his heart thumping in his chest as he waited for the police to arrive. He had done it. It was over. Amelia was gone, and soon the world would believe that her death was nothing more than a tragic end to a woman overwhelmed by the pressures of life. But what James didn't realize was that his plan was far from foolproof. The first signs of doubt would emerge almost immediately, and his carefully constructed lies were already starting to unravel. The scene that greeted the first responders was one of chaos. Amelia's body was discovered in their bedroom, with a pillowcase tied tightly around her neck. The scene appeared to match James's story. She was found with no signs of a struggle, positioned in a way that suggested she had taken her own life. James stood by, playing the part of the grieving husband, shaking his head and sobbing, claiming he had no idea what had happened. But something didn't sit right with the officers. There were no signs of forced entry. The house was calm, eerily so. But what really made them pause was the lack of visible distress on Amelia's body. There were no signs of a violent struggle, no defensive wounds, and no sign of trauma that would typically accompany a suicide. Amelia's death was, on the surface, a tragedy, but it was too neat, too clean. Detective Sarah Bennett was assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for finding the truth no matter how well it was hidden, Bennett quickly began to see the cracks in James's story. She asked questions, reviewed the evidence, and soon enough, she began to piece together the inconsistencies. There was no history of depression or suicidal tendencies in Amelia's background, and friends and family described her as a woman full of hope, especially in the months leading up to her death. She was eagerly awaiting the birth of her child. She had no reason to end her life. As Detective Bennett dug deeper, she uncovered more troubling details: James's financial troubles, the affair with Sophie, and the strange way James had acted in the days leading up to the crime. The evidence was beginning to paint a different picture, one that suggested Amelia's death might not have been a suicide after all. And James, who thought his plan had worked flawlessly, was beginning to realize that the truth was slipping out of his grasp. The investigation had only just begun. And in the coming days, everything James had worked so hard to hide would be exposed. Detective Sarah Bennett was no stranger to cases like this. She had seen the patterns before: stories that didn't quite add up, details that didn't line up with the evidence. But the case of Amelia Wright was different. From the moment she stepped into the Wrights' home, something about the scene felt off. James Wright had claimed that his wife had taken her own life. He spoke with the kind of rehearsed grief that was hard to ignore, but there were subtle clues that suggested he wasn't being entirely honest. Bennett's experience told her that the truth was buried somewhere beneath James's polished narrative, and it was her job to uncover it. The first step in the investigation was to review the crime scene in detail. The house was neat, too neat for someone who had just experienced such a traumatic event. There were no signs of a struggle. Amelia's body had been found in a position that made it look like a suicide, but the absence of defensive wounds and the lack of a true sense of desperation in her movements seemed to raise a red flag. When someone is in the throes of suicide, their body shows it: tension, panic, fear. But Amelia's body was strangely still. It seemed almost staged. Bennett began reviewing security footage from the house's exterior and from surrounding neighbors. James had claimed that he had been in the house alone with Amelia when he discovered her body. But the footage from a nearby camera showed something unexpected. Around the time of Amelia's death, a car matching James's description was seen leaving the neighborhood, something he had failed to mention. James had said he was home the entire time, but the video contradicted his account. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. Next, Bennett turned her attention to the witness statements. Neighbors described the Wrights as a happy couple, but some had noticed the increasing tension between them in the weeks leading up to Amelia's death. One neighbor recalled seeing James leave the house early on the morning of Amelia's death, a time when he had claimed to be sleeping. Another neighbor mentioned hearing loud arguing the night before, though they weren't able to make out the words. The inconsistencies in James's statements were stacking up, and Bennett knew that this was just the beginning. But it was the forensic evidence that truly started to crack the case open. The toxicology report from Amelia's autopsy revealed something shocking: traces of sedatives in her system. It was clear that she had been drugged before her death. This wasn't the work of someone who had impulsively decided to end their life. The sedatives found in her bloodstream suggested that she had been deliberately incapacitated, likely to make her more vulnerable to whatever James had planned. As Bennett continued to analyze the report, she found even more troubling evidence. The marks on Amelia's neck were unmistakable, deep, consistent impressions that indicated she had been strangled. While James had claimed that Amelia had hung herself, the autopsy revealed no signs of hanging at all. There was no rope, no typical ligature mark, and no fractures in the bones of her neck that would usually accompany a hanging. Instead, the strangulation marks were consistent with someone wrapping a cloth or fabric tightly around the victim's neck and applying force. Amelia had been murdered, strangled, then placed in a way that would make her death seem like a suicide. The forensic team also found traces of James' DNA under Amelia's fingernails, proof that she had fought back in her final moments. There were small abrasions on her skin, signs of a struggle. The evidence was mounting, and the inconsistencies in James's story were becoming impossible to ignore. James had claimed that he had found Amelia dead, but the evidence suggested a different story altogether. Detective Bennett knew that she was getting closer to the truth, but she also understood that James wasn't going to give up easily. He had already proven how far he was willing to go to cover up his tracks. The question now was, would the evidence be enough to break him, or would James continue to manipulate the truth to his advantage? As the investigation continued, Bennett focused on uncovering every last detail: the financial records, the phone records, the timeline of events. And each new piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of a man desperate to escape his life of lies. The more they uncovered, the more James's carefully constructed alibi began to unravel. In the weeks that followed, Bennett's team dug deeper into James's finances, discovering more about the extent of his debts and his involvement with Sophie, the woman he had been having an affair with. It all added up. His financial troubles, his affair, and the growing tension in his marriage had driven him to the edge. Amelia's death wasn't the result of a tragic emotional breakdown. It was the result of a cold, calculated plan. James Wright had murdered his wife, and now Detective Bennett had the evidence to prove it. The only question that remained was how far James would go to cover his tracks, and whether the truth would finally come to light before he could escape justice once again. The day of the arrest came quickly. Detective Bennett and her team had gathered all the evidence they needed. James Wright had been carefully building his story, but the walls were closing in around him. The sedatives, the strangulation marks, the financial troubles, all of it pointed to one undeniable truth. James had killed his wife. The arrest was inevitable, but it wasn't going to be easy. When James was brought into the interrogation room, he still wore the same mask of grief that he had since the first moment he reported Amelia's death. His suit was neatly pressed, his demeanor composed. He looked like a man who had just lost everything. But Bennett had seen this act before. She knew the real James Wright was hiding behind those rehearsed tears and calm words. As she sat across from him, Bennett watched closely, her eyes sharp, searching for any sign of weakness. James's face remained stoic, but his eyes betrayed him. He was nervous. His hands twitched slightly. His posture stiffened whenever the conversation shifted in a direction that threatened to expose his lies. Bennett started with a series of calm, almost casual questions, probing for any inconsistencies in his story. James, we've already spoken to the neighbors. We know about the arguments. We know about your affair. It's over. The truth is coming out. You don't have to keep lying. For a moment, James's eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a tight line. He wasn't ready to crack yet. I told you everything. Amelia was the love of my life. I don't know what happened. I came home, and she was just gone. His voice trembled slightly, but it was still that same rehearsed tone. Bennett knew he wasn't being truthful. Over the next hour, the questioning intensified. Bennett methodically walked him through the evidence, the phone records showing his frequent contact with Sophie, the toxicology report confirming the sedatives, the lack of struggle. With every new piece of evidence, James's confidence began to falter. He tried to stay calm, his words becoming increasingly defensive, but the cracks in his story were widening. James, you said you didn't leave the house that night, but we have footage of you driving away. Where were you going? His eyes darted to the side, avoiding direct contact with Bennett. I didn't leave. I don't know what you're talking about. But Bennett wasn't backing down. We've checked everything. The security footage, the timeline of your phone calls. You were there, but you lied. And that's not even the worst part, is it? You had to make sure Amelia's death looked like a suicide, didn't you? There was a moment of silence. James sat back in his chair, his eyes staring blankly at the table. It was the first time since the beginning of the interrogation that he had stopped defending himself. The weight of the evidence, the inevitability of his fate was starting to settle in. Then it happened. The moment that broke him. Bennett slid a final piece of evidence across the table. A picture of Amelia's body, her face frozen in a look of horror, the pillowcase around her neck. James's gaze lingered on the image, and for the first time, a flicker of panic passed through his eyes. "You thought you could get away with it," Bennett said softly. "But you were wrong. You murdered her, James. And now, it's over." The silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, James let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had suddenly crushed him. The facade was gone. He wasn't the grieving husband anymore. He was a man broken by the truth. I didn't think it would. I was just so desperate." His voice cracked, and tears welled in his eyes as the guilt poured out of him. "I thought if I could just make her. I didn't think it would end like this." It was the confession Bennett had been waiting for. The calm, calculated man who had tried to control every aspect of the investigation was now nothing more than a frightened man trying to explain away his actions. "I killed her," he whispered, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I killed her. I didn't know what else to do." The trial of James Wright was nothing short of a spectacle. In the courtroom, the tension was thick, the air charged with the weight of the accusations. James, now a defendant in a murder trial, sat in a dark suit, his once confident demeanor completely shattered. The prosecution, led by a seasoned attorney, laid out the case with methodical precision. Every piece of evidence, every detail of the investigation, was presented to the jury with the force of a hammer. The prosecution's case was strong. There was the damning forensic evidence, the toxicology report, the financial troubles that had driven James to desperation. But perhaps most damning was Sophie's testimony. The woman James had thought would help him escape, the woman he had thought would be his ticket to freedom, now turned on him. She described their affair in detail, painting James as a man who was willing to do anything to get what he wanted, even if it meant killing the woman who had been his wife. "James Wright didn't just kill his wife," Sophie testified, her voice steady but cold. "He killed her to get out of his problems. He wanted to be with me. He wanted to be free of his debts and his marriage. And he thought that by getting rid of Amelia, he could have everything he wanted." The defense, however, tried to paint James as a man overwhelmed by stress, a man who had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. They argued that James had never meant to kill Amelia, that it had been an accident, a momentary lapse in judgment during an argument. But the evidence told a different story. The forensic experts explained how Amelia's death had been carefully orchestrated. The sedatives, the strangulation. This wasn't an accident. It was premeditated. The trial continued for several weeks, but the final moments were the most intense. The jury deliberated, and when the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom was filled with a tense, heavy silence. Guilty. James Wright was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury had seen through his lies, his manipulations, and his attempt to escape justice. He had murdered his wife for his own selfish reasons, and now he would pay the price for it. As the judge announced the sentence, James' face went pale. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no escaping this time. The truth had caught up to him, and it was a truth he could never outrun. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, some of relief, some of disbelief. Amelia's family wept quietly in the front row, the justice they had longed for finally being served. The legacy of the crime remained, a chilling reminder of the lengths one man would go to in order to escape the consequences of his own actions. And as the gavel fell, the final chapter in the life of James Wright was written, a man who lost everything, including his humanity, all in the pursuit of his own desires. In the wake of Amelia's death, the neighborhood was shaken. What had been a tight-knit community now found itself reeling from the truth. People who had known James and Amelia for years couldn't reconcile the man they had seen every day with the murderer who had been hiding in plain sight. How could someone so close, so trusted, be capable of such a horrific crime? But more than just the grief of losing Amelia, this case sparked a much-needed conversation about domestic abuse, financial desperation, and the extremes to which some people would go to protect their secrets. It wasn't just a tragic story of a wife who had been murdered by her husband. It was a painful reminder of the psychological toll that financial strain, infidelity, and emotional manipulation can have on a relationship. Experts who weighed in on the case highlighted how James' financial troubles had pushed him to the breaking point. The pressure of mounting debts, the affair that promised a way out, and the fear of losing it all drove him to make a fatal decision. It wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a calculated act of self-preservation. But what made James's actions even more chilling was the coldness with which he executed his plan. He had methodically set the stage to make Amelia's death look like a suicide. He had planned every step, every detail, in an effort to avoid facing the consequences of his own choices. As the case gained more attention, local officials and community leaders began to speak out. This wasn't just about one man's crime. It was about the broader issues of domestic violence and the often hidden toll it takes on victims. Experts explained that many cases of domestic abuse, both physical and emotional, go unnoticed until it's too late. The warning signs are there, but they're often ignored or misunderstood by those closest to the victim. Amelia's death became a catalyst for change. Conversations about the warning signs of abuse, the importance of financial transparency in relationships, and the need for more support for victims began to take center stage. Local organizations that provided resources for women in abusive relationships saw an increase in awareness and support. In the months that followed, new policies were introduced to better identify and address financial coercion and emotional manipulation within marriages. Lawmakers and community leaders acknowledged that financial desperation could be just as dangerous as physical abuse, and they began to push for reforms to better protect people who might feel trapped in toxic relationships. Amelia's story had become a painful lesson, a lesson about the hidden struggles that can exist behind closed doors, and the lengths some people would go to in order to escape their own mistakes. It was a harsh reminder that not all tragedies are immediately visible, and that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones capable of the most unspeakable acts. As the dust settled, the town began to rebuild, but the impact of Amelia's death would never truly fade. The lessons learned would linger, etched in the memories of those who had lived through it, and in the reforms that followed. It was a painful chapter in the town's history, but it was one that, in the end, might help save others from a similar fate. As the dust settled and the community slowly began to heal, the story of James Wright and Amelia Wright would live on in the minds of those who knew them. It would become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the fragile line between love and deceit, between loyalty and betrayal. The events that led to Amelia's death were tragic, but the legacy of this case would last far beyond the courtroom. Was James truly a man driven to madness by the weight of his debts, his failing marriage, and his desperate desire to escape? Or was he always a cold-blooded murderer, capable of planning a life-altering act with the precision and care of someone who had been preparing for this moment all along? It is a question that will never have a clear answer. James's defense tried to paint him as a victim of circumstance, someone who had simply snapped under the weight of his own mistakes. But the cold, hard truth was that James had taken a life. The perfect execution of his plan, his attempt to make Amelia's death appear as a suicide, shows a level of premeditation and calculation that goes beyond mere desperation. His affair with Sophie, his financial troubles, and his fear of losing everything were all pieces of the puzzle. But they didn't excuse what he had done. They didn't explain the ruthless actions he took to protect himself, to escape the consequences of his choices. For Amelia's family, the questions will linger forever. Could they have seen the signs? Could they have known that their daughter, their sister, was in danger? Could they have done something to stop it? These are the kinds of questions that only deepen the pain of loss. The guilt that so many people feel when faced with the tragedy of an unexpected death often turns inward. How could they have known? How could they have saved her? And for the community, the unanswered questions run deep. How could someone they had all trusted, someone who seemed like a loving husband and a responsible member of the community, be capable of such violence? James had lived among them, had smiled and waved as a neighbor. The man they saw every day was the same man who had plotted his wife's murder. How could they have missed the signs? Were there clues all along that they simply didn't see? Human nature, it seems, is full of contradictions. How far are we willing to go to protect the things we want, and at what cost? James Wright's actions were driven by a complex mix of fear, selfishness, and a twisted sense of entitlement. In the end, he thought he could escape the consequences of his actions. He thought he could outsmart everyone. But in the process, he destroyed not only his own life, but the life of a woman who had trusted him with everything. As the house where the crime took place now stands empty, its windows dark and silent, it serves as a haunting reminder of the brutal truth behind James's facade. The echoes of Amelia's life, her laughter, her plans for the future, the warmth she brought to everyone around her, are now just memories. And in the wake of her tragic death, the house stands as a monument to the choices made, the choices that led to a young woman's untimely end. The real tragedy is not just Amelia's death, but the fact that it could have been prevented. If only there had been more attention to the warning signs, more intervention in the right moment. It raises unsettling questions about how often the people around us are hiding their darkest secrets, and how far someone will go when they believe they have no other way out. So, was James a man driven to madness by his circumstances, or was he a cold-blooded murderer from the start? It's a question that no amount of evidence can fully answer, but it leaves us wondering, what makes someone capable of such a crime? And how do we truly know the people closest to us? As we close this chapter of the story, I leave you with these thoughts. What drives people to commit such heinous acts? Is it desperation? Is it the loss of control? Or is it something darker within them? Something that emerges when pushed to the edge? If you've been following this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think James was a man who simply lost himself in the chaos of his own life? Or was he always capable of murder? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more true crime stories like this one. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and never stop asking the tough questions.